With your pattern complete, you're ready to start laying out the pattern and cutting your garment to proceed to the next step. A few tools and supplies are necessary before you start your cutting layout. You should have your pattern prepared, whether it is a muslin or paper pattern. You need an L square, a cutting scissor, a smaller pair of cutting scissors to clip corners, notches, cutting curves, areas which are a little hard to reach with a large scissor, pins, weights. The next step after cutting, you need your carbon or tracing paper, white only, and a tracing wheel that is suitable for the type of fabric you're going to be using. Your sewing supplies, hand stitching for your thread tracing, and a clipper. Once you've assembled all your supplies, you're ready to start preparing your fabric. And whatever the fabric, it doesn't matter what type of fabric you're using, what nature of fabric, what composition of the fabric, you have to be aware that you must block your fabric. We'll put these out of the way so we can have a clear table. The first thing you must be aware of with your particular fabric is that it must be blocked. It must be aligned perfectly on the square. By the nature of many yarns, you're going to find once you have your fabric and you unroll it off the roll or unwrap it from your package, when you place the fabric against the edge of the table and you fold it in half, you're going to find that it is not perfectly aligned, that my two edges are not matching. One way to remedy that, and it may be able to be remedied, is to block. And the process of blocking is pulling the fabric along the bias to the opposite corner. And you pull your fabric, you keep tugging this fabric along the entire length of your yard goods. Now, granted, most of the time you will be using 3 to 4 yards of fabric, and this takes quite a bit of tugging, but it must be done. On occasion, you may find it simpler to borrow someone and have someone stand at the other end of the fabric, and you are busy tugging back and forth. Once you have tugged to where you think you are in good shape, you reline your fabric once more and check it out. If you see, and when you see, you have lined up perfectly all right, then you're ready to go to the iron and press, and the fabric is ready for layout. In laying out your fabric, you may find that you do not have enough room to lay out your particular pattern pieces with the fabric folded as you desire. For instance, most of the time your fabric will be folded on the lengthwise grain. That is, this is my selvage, selvage, and I fold the garment or the fabric with the right side to the inside, and we're on the lengthwise grain. On occasion, you're going to find that in order to get more mileage out of your fabric, you have to open up a whole piece of goods and fold it what we call crosswise grain. And you will have your selvages lined up together and the fold on the crosswise. This gives you more width and allows you to put in a more complicated pattern or a wider pattern, a pattern that has a skirt that has a lot of sweep to it. If you have a fabric that is cut on the one way or a napped fabric, you're going to have to cut your fabric and bring right sides together and make sure that your alignment is the same. That is, if you have a napped fabric or a one-way pattern, that they're both going in the same direction. We have one more type of layout that you're going to find you may need once in a while, and that is a fold towards the center, or an uneven fold, but a fold that has been aligned together. You have a fold on the outside of the goods, and you have a fold on the other side of the goods. Once more, the right side to the inside, and our selvage is matching. In a case like this, one must make sure that the width of your fabric is the same the entire length of the goods. This type of fold is called a gatefold. Once you have decided on the fold of fabric that you wish, we're ready to approach your fabric. Now, there are many different types of fabrics. And fabrics create, by the difference in the fabrics, you may have problems. One fabric that may create a problem is a napped fabric. We have corduroys, velvets, flannels, fleeces, satins, fabric that have a definite one-way pattern to them. This is your corduroy that is in one direction. If we take and shift the pattern and then join a seam, the same piece of fabric has two distinctly different colors. I have here a sampler which has been stitched. These are both cut on the length grain and joined together. And as you can see, one looks dull and one looks bright. I have another piece that has been joined, the cross grain against the length grain, and here too you have a difference or a shading off. Since this does happen with velvets and corduroys and napped fabrics in general, one has to be very careful in laying out and cutting your fabric that it won't happen. Another fabric that is not actually a nap, but is a weave also creates a problem, and you must be aware of it when you're laying out, and that is your satin. Your satin is very, very shiny. The shine is created by the weave. You can take and reverse the direction of your satin. Nothing will happen to your shine. But you cannot take and place your satin in the opposite direction. For instance, I will pin a few pins in to hold this in place so you will be able to see it when I hold it up. For instance, one generally cuts a shirt on the length grain, but you then take and cut your cuffs on the length grain, so when you are stitching, your cuffs will be length grain against the cross grain of your sleeve. Now, when you hold up your satin, you can see it has shaded off. The same color has a different shade on cross versus length. So one must be very careful with satin not to let that happen. You can see a darker color against a lighter color. Well, so be it for the differences in weaves. Always, always test your fabric, even if you think it is a plain weave and does not appear to have a nap. It's much safer to test it than to be sorry afterwards. Now, we have a lot of different fabrics to show you that require matching. You have the gingham check. The gingham check, on occasion, is the same check in both directions, but be very careful to see whether that is actually happening. And what you do is then take your length grain and place it against your cross grain to check if that is true. If it is, one can interchange the grains if necessary. If not, and this is very clearly not, you must be careful with your grains. An option to cut something on an opposite grain rather than on the same when necessary. And of course, bias comes in very handy. That's why most frequently you'll find gingham checks trimmed with bias. You have here an even plaid. By an even plaid, we mean a plaid that the fabric may be folded on the length grain and matched to the opposite side. You may find that that really saves a lot of fabric, and this plaid is even both going across and lengthwise. So if I were to fold it on the lengthwise grain, as I have here, and fold it through to the other side and lay out my pattern pieces, I will be able to indeed interlock it because my crosswise grain is also the same. I could not possibly put length grain against cross grain and expect it to match, but I would have a much easier type of layout with an even plaid. With a uneven plaid or an uneven stripe, and I have both that. This is an uneven stripe, and by an uneven stripe, it's very easily seen that the stripes follow in the same direction and they do not match back the other way. Therefore, when you have an uneven stripe or an uneven plaid, the garment must be laid out on the single. That is, the fabric opened flat, wide, and your pattern pieces laid out in order to match. And each piece has to be laid separately. Therefore, when you have an uneven plaid or an uneven stripe, you must have every piece of pattern that you plan on cutting. That is a whole front and a whole back, all the collars and all the pockets. You cannot rely on just half a garment. Another pattern or fabric that may create a problem is your border print. And that's just what this is. The lengthwise grain is this way. This is the length grain, with the selvages on this edge and that edge. Now, what you have here is a very pretty border along one selvage. Therefore, when you are laying out with a border print, you must be aware that you may probably have to turn your pattern pieces so they fall with the border, if you wish, at the hem of the skirt. Border prints create a problem in styling. So you must be very much aware of a border print when you are draping or making your pattern. It will very often affect the design of the garment. And finally, we come to a pattern much like a plaid or a stripe, excepting this is a very, very, very bold print. And indeed, this bold print creates two problems. One problem is that it is a one-way print. And a one-way print is a print where all the flowers or leaves or houses or animals are printed in one direction. We have a flower here and a flower there and a flower there and there, and they're all printed in one direction, going in one direction. So when you have that kind of a problem, you must be aware and lay out your fabric, your pattern pieces accordingly. Another problem that this fabric has is that because the fabric print is so bold, you must be aware that you should match the pattern pieces on the flower. So if a seam falls in one position, you must have the other half of the seam finishing up that position. For instance, if you had a seam falling through the center of this flower, you would have to have the other half of the pattern falling through the center of the flower, so it completes the pattern. And indeed, when you lay this out and you're designing this, you will also have to be aware of the placement of the flowers in relationship to the particular design you're working with. All right, we have handled several different fabrics, and you're aware of the problems that may occur. And we're ready to move on to actually laying out our fabrics. Oh, one other problem that seems to happen, and people are often a little stymied: how to cut a very sheer fabric, how to lay out a very sheer fabric. Because very often you find, and as we will be doing, is putting our pattern pieces right on the fabric, that when you have to put pattern pieces on a sheer fabric, a chiffon or a georgette, or a crepe de chine, you're going to find this fabric slips and slides. So an easy way to remedy that is to take and slide your layers of fabric between two layers of paper. And then we take our pattern piece and put it on top of the paper, pinning through all the layers and then cutting it. You will always get a very accurate pattern shape if you do that. Now, we're going to take and make a layout. If you have a printed fabric or a fabric that has a definite right or wrong side, make sure that your fabric has been prepared and is folded with the right side to the inside. Flat out, no changes. Whatever fabric you're using, if it has a definite right or wrong side, the right side to the inside. And how do we prepare our fabrics? Well, remember we blocked it. And even that, always make sure you do not start your blocking without a ripped edge. Both ends of your fabric must be ripped. What happens if you cannot rip it? It's not too difficult. You snip in and you pull a thread. When you pull a thread, you dislodge the grains enough to see where that fabric is on grain, and then you may cut. And that way you can trim away a piece of your fabric on grain. Never start cutting or laying out your fabric if your fabric has not been either ripped or trimmed, but it always must be on grain on both lengths. And ripping isn't so hard either. You just very gently pull it so as not to dislodge too much of the edge. Well, we're going to be ready to lay it out, our fabrics out, and the best thing to do is to clear the table. And we'll take a nice new piece of goods and check our layout. Check the fold. Make sure that your selvages are aligned. A good piece of fabric should have the selvages very nicely stretched out, which should not interfere with, have interfered with your blocking or layout. If your selvage does interfere, you should clip at intervals, since the selvage is never incorporated into the cutting of a garment, to release any pull. It is never too desirable to remove the selvage before you have cut. If your fabric is slippery, well then, work between two layers of paper. It is not always advisable to pin along the selvage. You can frequently forget that you have a pin along your selvage and end up by cutting through the fabric. Well, our fabric is pretty well lined up, and we'll start our layout. To make sure we have all our tools ready, we'll line it up, and we'll bring our pins elsewhere, and we'll select a pattern. Perhaps we will start with a dress. What do you have to see when you have your pattern? You have to have every piece necessary. Now, since we're cutting the fabric on the fold, we only need half a garment. If you're cutting a garment that is asymmetric, you would have all the pieces that involve the asymmetric cut. And you make sure that you have all markings on the pattern pieces. The seam allowances are marked and trimmed correctly. The grain lines, you always must mark your grain lines, and your grain lines must always be marked length grain, always having an arrow that indicates the length grain of the pattern piece. That's very, very important. We'll also mark off all the notches wherever you must clip to indicate where you're going to have a matching point. And these notches are indicated with little U's, as you can see, just like a U, right where the notch will occur. If you have made any corrections on your pattern because you've changed a style or something, make sure that you've made your corrections in another color so you will not get confused and mark the wrong area. Once your pattern pieces are all selected and you know you have every piece for your garment, we start by making a layout. And the whole point of a layout is that you want to save as much fabric as possible and to utilize all the fabric that you can. Now, you may find that it's easy enough to interlock your pieces to allow you to save fabric. And saving fabric is very, very important. We're using the weights to hold the fabric, the muslins, in place. And understanding the problem with knowing you must save your fabric, you keep going and experiment with your layout. Every piece of fabric, every piece of pattern you're putting on your fabric may not finish off exactly where you intended it to finish off. You should feel free to shift your pattern pieces to make sure that they will be laid in correctly. Wherever you need a fold, you place your pieces that need to be placed on the fold. Wherever you need a straight grain, you place your pieces according to the straight grain. And once you've gotten all your pieces laid in your layout, and you have, according to your plan, saved fabric, and that is a very important criteria for any kind of a layout, is to save fabric, you will very carefully place the pattern pieces now according to the grain. That is, this particular pattern piece must be placed in on grain. This is my grain line. And in order to find the correct grain line and align it against the pattern piece, I put a pin in at the base of the arrow, and I'm going to measure from the arrow to the edge of my fabric and take that measurement and move it to the top of the arrow. And in that way, I know I'm aligned on the grain parallel to my selvage. Once more, this was a little askew. I take the measurements from one arrow and transfer that measurement to the top of the arrow, and now I must shift the pattern piece so it fits the same way, and there we are. I'm ready. That has been set in according to grain, and I would have to do it with all my pieces. Once my pieces are lined up correctly, we'll pin them. Pinning is also important. With some fabrics, in fact, a pin will leave a mark in the fabric. It will leave a hole. So you must be very, very careful to get used to always placing your pin in the seam allowance area of your garment. Just in the seam allowance. Avoid placing pins within the framework of the garment. And we'll put in our pins If your fabric has been prepared correctly, you would not need too many pins. Now, what happens when you come to the fold? You've got to hold your fabric down. Well, you can put in 2 pins if you are very careful and line up your fabric against the fold. You may use a weight to hold it. And just stick your pins in at the bottom edge and at the top edge. But don't put in any pins at the center front where you may leave residue. Sometimes pins have fallen on the floor and are dirty, and sometimes a pin may have a burr on it, and if you were making a satin garment, you would make marks down the front of your garment. Well, we'll proceed to pin the pattern pieces down, following all the rules that we have learned. And primarily, rule 1 is to save fabric. And rule 2, to line up all your pattern pieces according to the grain that you have selected in your original design. And if you are planning on, if you're cutting a garment with a one-way fabric, all your pattern pieces will have to be laid out in one direction. If you're planning to cut your garment, as I am, in a fabric that allows for interlocking, then your pattern pieces will be cut according to that. Now, on occasion, as you saw, I was using a weight. In some sample rooms, weights are used instead of pins. But these are generally very, very experienced sample hands. When you're just starting, you may find a weight will not work according to your plan, and you may find you're slipping too easily. So you don't use a weight. But a weight does help you hold your pattern pieces in place while you're pinning. It's necessary to know how to learn how to use weights, but if you're just starting to sew, you're going to find that that isn't the ideal solution. Always wait until you are more comfortable with a procedure rather than try to accomplish something that you're not too sure of. And here we are, and my goodness, I certainly made it in my yardage. I estimated correctly, and I now have just about the right amount to allow my sleeve to go in. And we'll pin it down, and we're ready to cut. Let's cut out a few pieces. We have some examples here of different layouts. The patterns pinned exactly in place on fabric. This is a sample of a cross-fold layout. The selvages are pinned together with a fold along the cross grain. And the selvages once more are pinned together. This cross-fold layout is an interlocked layout. By that, it is the fabrics, the pattern pieces have been interlocked in order to save fabric. At the same time, it is an all-over pattern. It is not a one-way pattern. As you can see, the different parts of the pattern pieces are going in different directions. A sample of a cross-fold layout. underneath this layout, we have a sample of a gatefold. A gatefold is often used when you have more than enough pieces that have to be laid out on the fold, and there's not enough yardage to accommodate all these fold pieces. So some of your fabric is cut off and laid selvage, folded selvage to selvage. Your gatefold may be uneven. That is, you may not always have to have your fold dividing the fabric evenly. You may have an uneven gatefold. But most of the time you need a gatefold to show and to use enough of your fold. We have a lot of pieces in this particular garment that needed to be cut out on the fold. And this is a sample of a gatefold. We will now show you a one-way. Now, a one-way layout is a layout where all the garment, parts of the garment, must be laid out in one direction. That is, the top of the garment on all your pieces must be in the same direction. This must be used for napped fabrics, for, as the corduroy or velvet I demonstrated earlier, and for patterns that must be laid out in one direction. Also for even plaids that are one-way even plaids. Now, the next layout I would like to show you is a plaid that is even going across the fabric and an even divided or working its way down the fabric. If you have an even plaid that you can fold in the center, and your fabric is also of a plaid that you can place your pattern pieces in opposite directions so it does not have to go one way, you'll find that you can save a great deal of fabric. The one thing you have to be aware of when laying out a fold on a plaid is that your matching points have to come out at exactly the same point in order that this plaid will match smoothly, such as under the arm, at the shoulder, lining up on side seams, etc. This is for an even plaid. Now, on occasion, you have a garment that must be cut on the bias or an asymmetric garment. So therefore, you must have a complete pattern. And when you lay out your pattern, you must lay out your pattern on the right side of the goods. I happen to have a bias skirt here, and this skirt being cut on the bias has to be laid out completely open. This is the entire front of the pattern, and here we have the entire back. But as you'll notice, it is laid out on the right sides of the goods, single thickness, according to your grain. It does not always have to be bias. Occasionally you have a plaid that must be matched, and this is the same way on the single thickness. I do have a sample of a plaid to show you, and this plaid is also one way. Not only is it one way in one direction, it's one way in the other direction. And when that happens to a plaid or a stripe, you must cut every piece of your pattern separately. So we have here the front of the skirt, both the left left front and the right front, and the back of the skirt right and left. And in this manner, we may be sure that we will get a match when we lay out a one-way plaid. And here we had some samples of our layout. One of the things you must be aware of when you're cutting is that it may be simpler and there is nothing else that may be cut in these places, in these areas, to separate your pieces of garment for cutting purposes. In that way, you may find it's simpler and more accurate in your cutting that you can approach your cutting from the right direction. For instance, just put this to one side because it gets very crowded on a cutting table. And approach. Now we have a back. And we have a scissor. And I am right-handed. When you're right-handed, you always cut with the edge of the garment against the edge of the scissor, and the garment is on your left, so you can see exactly where you're cutting. To take and cut a garment with the garment on the right-hand side of the scissor, when you're a right-handed person, is not very good because you cannot see your pattern piece. If I were a left-handed person, I would be all right because I would then be able to see my pattern piece. But always cut with your garment on the side opposite the hand you cut with. Therefore, when we isolate our pattern pieces, as I have, you're going to find it is a lot simpler to keep your pattern shapes to the side you need. Once you have completed cutting out your pattern pieces, you have to snip your notches. And as the vanishing point, the pickup point of my darts must be snipped, and my neckline, and my seams, and my notches, I snip. But as you watch, you'll see I'm only snipping in a fraction of an inch. It's perhaps the deepest is 1/4 of an inch. Anywhere from 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch is all you may snip for a notch. Anything deeper will interfere in your seam allowance. Now, if you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, as I have here, you're going to find that you can only snip in 1/8 of an inch. You must take that accordingly. Once you have completed all your snipping and your cutting, we're ready to mark it. And marking is with your carbon paper, with the waxy part of the carbon paper up. Make sure that you're using white only. Any other color of carbon paper will be visible for the life of the garment. You're going to find that it never comes out in washing or cleaning. and applying sufficient pressure, follow your lines to give you all the lines that you have designed and are needed on your garment. Now, although I'm marking my center back and that is on straight grain, do not copy your grain line. Copying your grain line interferes with the styling of the garment, and indeed it may leave a mark on the face of the garment, and you really don't need that. Mark off your darts and all your seams. When you've completed marking all your seams, you're going to find that one half of the garment is completely marked with your carbon. Completely marked. Now, we remove our pattern piece because we now have to transfer our markings to the other half of the garment. Replace a few pins so you do not slip, because you still want the same size. You don't want to change this in any way. Put the other half of the garment face down and follow all your carbon lines once more to transfer this to the other half of the garment. Now, in some sample rooms, the sample hands are so experienced that they find carboning is unnecessary, and they can judge the seam allowance by the notches and are sufficiently skilled to be able to assemble a garment, to baste a garment, and for a fitting without any carboning. But that takes a lot of skill. Sometimes we have to switch over to check out, did we carbon that line or didn't we? So we just keep going until the whole pattern has been carboned. Once you have completely